Hello again for part two. Um, let's see now. The problem is I've got to try to remember what the fuck I was talking about in part one. Um, I know I mentioned morality and immorality, and no doubt mentioned the law of freedom because that's the train I'm on at the moment. Um, but yeah, so I think we were no. I was talking about. I was going to talk a little bit more about demonic entities, the way I see them as objective beings who exist in our world, who have been, you know, our world that we live in is, interlinked with a multitude of other realms and worlds. Now, most people think of these as existing apart from each other, but they don't. They exist as one whole. Um, Going into parallel universes and stuff like that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about a parallel world of objective beings necessarily that exists apart from this world but occupies the same space. I'm talking more about different layers of reality and different planes of being or dimensions of being. Um, and if we can understand for a minute that there are certain dimensions that are unable to be measured at this time by modern science, um, probably the only measure we've got and the only capacity we have to observing these worlds is spiritual science or occult science, which is still just as efficacious as modern day physical or materialism, like modern day science versus occult science. There are areas where they definitely overlap, but then there are areas where occult science is still miles and miles ahead of modern science, because obviously modern science has been the culmination of centuries of indoctrination, of censorship, of the elite directing the world in the way they want. Now, many of the elite know too that there are these other realms and dimensions to the world. Um, and the reason why I always we can't talk about demons without talking about morality. So we can't talk about demons without talking about right action, right and wrong action, because it's almost 100. Well, it is. It's 100% the case is that it is through wrong action or immoral action that allows these demons to step over the threshold, if you will, to feed basically off of our energy bodies, which leads to a deterioration of both mental states, physical states. They have an incredible impact because they essentially suck the vital life force. I mean, that pranic energy, whatever you want to call it, rock. Um, I probably don't say that right. I'm not Jewish, but to me, it is a rock, or the vital life principle of Kabbalah, whatever it might be called. You have this life principle or this life force, this vital life force or vital life energy that these demonic entities do feed off of. It's a process that we attract them in and we give that to them. I mean, essentially, they're going to take whatever we're not using. And when we're living in sort of attunement, in alignment, and in harmony with that vital life principle, um, you know, essentially in that sort of love vibration or light vibration towards the higher states of being and higher states of consciousness. And when we're not operating in those higher is a very obscure term when we're talking about in terms of spiritual sort of enlightenment and stuff like that, because it's not essentially or effectively higher, it's in fact more involved in the world. That's another misconception altogether that, has again been sort of pushed and propagated by these ruling elites and this new age movement, this idea of ascension beyond the human to something that is, superhuman or better than, um, which has created a lot of inflation of the ego and people really have lost their true sense of self and understanding. So yeah, so we've got that, um, living in attunement with that life principle, which we don't do. We eat all the wrong foods, we say all the wrong things, we think all the wrong things. We're not living in attunement with the truth or with our true selves and with what we should be doing. Um, so yeah, this part two was about a little bit more about maybe my experience with how I view or remote view these entities. And now I had my first encounter, like I said, I had this encounter with a physically manifested demonic entity that had mass to it, though it was still relatively etheric. It was on the threshold, and I had attracted that and brought that into my life through my own wrong action. Um, my drug and alcohol abuse and my attitude towards the world had manifested, and because I'd always had ties to the occult and to the magical sort of psychic world, I had brought this entity with me along my journey and had given it enough power to the point where it had actually been able to take on physical form or semi-physical etheric form, but it was visible to the naked eye. Um, you know, and I knew at that point that I was on the threshold myself of, if something didn't change, if I did not make it, changes and try to do things a little differently in my life, then I was going to be consumed essentially by this being, entirely taken over. And it wasn't until later when I'd met my sort of spiritual advisor or my guide in life, my master, where he talked about, and he compared it to like the agents in the Matrix, where, you know, he basically said if you become soulless enough, if you're not using, the higher faculties, and you're not living in your truth, you know, we get a lot of warnings when we get a lot of kickback. We get a lot of signs to say, hey, you're not living right. If we choose still not to listen, eventually we become like empty shells of the people that we're meant to be, because, eventually our higher beings that we have the potential to be leave us for the time being. Like, not completely, obviously, because they're still attached to us, but they will just decide that in this life, well, too bad at the moment. You can always call them back up and be vitalized and reignited as a spiritual being. But when you're not using it and you're just basically a body going through the motions, getting stuck in those bad habits, um, and almost ritually so that you're almost every day performing a ritual that encourages demonic entities to enter into the world, um, eventually these entities will take you over completely, and that is what I believe to be, the worst form of possession, is the possession that seems normal. So, and that occurs all the time. I see it everywhere I go. I mean, you see it when you see like a poor, you know, a homeless person who has lost the will to live, and they're not looking after themselves. They're sleeping in the gutter. They've got horrible sores and abrasions and lesions on them because, I mean, they've attracted that being into their lives. And I know this, like, sometimes it sounds harsh and people get a bit upset about that and say, well, sometimes homeless people can't help. And everyone can help their situation that they're in. Everyone can do something. And I'm not saying that, it's not even, because you see some homelessness. I'm not going to dwell on the homeless thing, it was just one example, but you'll see some people who are quite active with it, and they make something of it and they get back out of it and move on. But then it's the ones that give up that end up very sick, or um, on the streets, and lifeless, soulless, mindless. Either they've gotten involved with drugs or alcohol, whatever it might be. That's the same for, like, I see a lot of junkies, a lot of drug addicts that I feel for on some level, because I understand the nature of addiction. But on another level, I have to say that you can see that like some of them have almost entirely been taken over by a demonic entity to the point where they've become aggressive creatures. They're no longer human, and that sounds harsh again, but for the time being, while under that demonic influence, I mean, essentially you're no longer human. You have become something else, and we'll talk more about that next time. But yeah, so these demonic entities that definitely do exist, and you can observe them in the world. Um, but yeah, if you want to observe them remotely, you really have to put yourself into a negative state of mind. So you have to put yourself to that passive negative state of mind, um, where can have that, and focus on that in meditation, what you want to see. And you want to know more about them, you need to really put all your attention onto that. A lot of people don't want to do that. It's frightening. It can be very frightening. Um, you just have to make sure you've got the necessary blocks up, necessary defenses that, whether it is through pentacles or um, whether it's through ritual, put in some defense mechanisms, whatever it might be. Keep, like, sage is a powerful one for people because it has this mystical property to it, and people understand it as a banishing tool. But always remember, if you are doing banishings, banishing rituals, banishings with sage, and you're trying to like banish an entity who is essentially like, understand that there's a lot of pushback often from banishings because, I mean, think about yourself in your own world and how you react to being attacked by someone, either verbally or physically. I mean, most of the time, most people fight back or try and defend themselves. Every other entity in the known universe that has some form of consciousness has that same reaction. Animals do it. Even plants to a certain degree have defense mechanisms. So, understand that banishings don't necessarily have to be towards destroying or killing out an entity you're attacking it. It's more about trying to cleanse the area you're working with and protect from attack. Always work with the idea of protecting from attack, not with the idea of attacking something else. That's important. It's not often actually taught in occult circles either. So for banishings and stuff like that, a lot of people think of it as attacking or destroying something. But I'll warn against that because you can sort of elicit the opposite, response to what you intend. So always focus on defense. Set up your defenses first. Go into meditation. You can view these creatures, entities, whatever. To me, they present as a dark mass that looks oddly like, almost leech-like. They're not the same shape all the time. They sit in different locations. But the typical spot I've seen these entities amass themselves is at the back of the head, working their way down the spine to sort of the Kundalini center. And you have these black masses, and often there'll be multiple. But that's essentially what the creature is, to my ability to view it. Um, and if you are able to get to a point where you can see these entities clearly, you can identify where they are on yourself even. Um, Once we identify them and objectify them and put them out there and see them as objective beings, then we can start working to sort of fighting them and understanding how we can, repair ourselves and help others to repair, and strengthening that auric field and strengthening our vital life force by living harmoniously with that life love principle. Anyway, for now, that's part two. I'm going to sign off. Take from that what you will. If you do happen to see this video, hit me up in the comments for anything that you might like to know if you're interested in this stuff. Give me ideas of stuff to talk about that I can go into with you guys. And give me some knowledge. You got some knowledge bombs to drop or experiences that you've had to drop. Drop them in the comments. I will read all comments and I will reply as well. So, yeah, anyway, for now, take care, peace profound, and fraternally yours in Lux.